listening to Pod Catalyst, the official podcast of IABC, where communicators from around the world tell their stories. Let's get started with today's episode. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Pod Catalyst. I'm Kristen Frankevich, your host for today, and I'll be joined in just a moment by David Imber, the principal at David Imber Advisory, a corporate public affairs practice. David focuses on not only public affairs, crisis communications, issues management, but also has a really strong background in political communication. So today we talked about the fact that 2024 is the year of elections, and how do communicators navigate that space? How do we find common ground in polarized places? What is the overlap? If you don't think you're into politics, what can you learn from political communications? So really great conversation with David today. I appreciated his time, and let's get started with the show.
Hello, I'm David Imber. I'm a communications professional from Melbourne, Australia. I run my own business, David Imber Advisory, specialising in issues and crisis management, and I've got a long-term interest in politics and public affairs.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to take a moment to kind of understand your career path and how you got where you are today before we get into our topic. So tell me how you got into public affairs and political communications. I mean, what sparked your interest, and at what stage in your career were you?
Well, that's a great question, because a lot of us in communications come here from another domain. And I didn't start with a journalism degree or a communications degree. I actually got a law degree, and I was really interested in going into government and being a public servant, a civil servant, and, working in government administration. That was really what I thought I would do. And I started to do that, working for the Commonwealth Government of Australia and also for my state government, the Victorian government. And then I moved into the not-for-profit sector in 2004 and became what was called then the policy and liaison worker for the Tenants Union of Victoria. So really helping an organisation focused on legal assistance and renters' rights. And my job was kind of half policy and half communications. And it was the first comms job I'd ever had. So I really went there because I was interested in public affairs and issues. I've always been interested in politics, but that was really the first job where I actually had communications as part of my remit, and I just loved it and did a lot of media and a lot of communications in that role. Worked on our newsletters and worked on our public materials, and it was just a lot of fun to have that communications, that immediate ability to engage with the community, as well as, the slightly drier policy-related writing and the meetings we'd have, behind the scenes with politicians.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, you really blended that interest in politics with your communications career. Yeah.
I just found, it was really in some ways a really lucky job. I'd had a time with a minister working as a public servant, but in a minister's office. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to contribute to parliamentary debates and play that, very direct role with a politician. And then I really saw all the people who were having a lot of fun going in and out of his office were the people who were campaigning for something, lobbying for something. And it was really apparent to me that part of the work was actually the policy design and the sort of technical stuff. But a lot of the passion and a lot of the energy and a lot of the persuasion came out of communications. And that's just it's really, driven me for the last 20 years.
Well, I think that's a good segue into what I want to ask you next, which is, not everybody thinks politics is for them. People might shy away from it. Clearly, you've found that lovely overlap, that niche that sparks your interest. So where do you see that overlap in the work of a political communicator and someone who might be, say, in a corporate communications role, a brand strategist, someone in internal comms? I mean, tell us, what does that Venn diagram look like?
It's a very good point. And I mean, obviously on that Venn diagram, it includes people who are complete political communicators. And I've had the opportunity to work with them and done some, direct political communications work And, I'm sure for those listeners in the US at the moment, there are a lot of people on all of those elections, whether they're the presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, governor campaigns, right down the line, who are doing comms, writing newsletters, writing door hangers, writing memes, getting right in amongst it. There are people whose whole job is communications to particular groups too. And all of the stuff we do in communications, audiences, so thinking about segmentation, thinking about channel. So, on the one end, there's people whose kind of whole life is that. And then on the other end, there's people who, as you say, might not think politics is for them. And I understand that. And certainly in a lot of organizations, if your job is fast moving consumer goods or, you're working in a university and you think, my job is education and perhaps helping, then I think for me, communications and politics comes together because politicians and politics is so ever present. It's very difficult to think of, a part of our industry where there isn't some intersection with politics because, in democracies, we all have the right to vote. And so there is, a real opportunity for impact. And then there's also just the reality of where politics sits in communities. Lots of organisations in some parts of their business are regulated. We saw during the pandemic how significant the role of government was in determining whether we could or couldn't go out, whether we could or couldn't do stuff. And so I think, while party politics isn't for everybody, and I certainly understand lots of people, get very upset at the idea of sort of politics in the workplace, like, standing up with a Trump sign or a Harris sign. That sort of politics in the workplace can be very difficult and destructive. But understanding the forces behind, the ability of the company you work for or the organization you work for to operate and to understand where the folks you're dealing with are coming from, that really, I think, is where the Venn diagram comes together. And understanding politics can make, your job as a communications professional a lot more rewarding and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about knowing your audience, right? Whether you're in politics or not.
Absolutely. And understanding the interplay between your audience and politics. So, for example, at the moment in Australia, our two largest supermarkets, we have two very big supermarket chains that are national, they have just been essentially told they're going to be sued by our competition regulator over lying around pricing and pretending things were on special when really the prices had been risen before being reduced. Now, cost of living is a huge political issue here. I know it's a huge political issue in the US. The economy is a top issue for people in the presidential election. All the polls are telling us that. So that might be, on the one hand, a political issue, but I've just given you an example about two supermarkets in Australia. Them understanding the political power of cost of living at the moment is informing the way they're responding to that challenge. And I think there are so many organizations, I can imagine across the US particularly, but, right across the world at election time, understanding how your business or your organization can be impacted, but also how to take advantage of the political environment. Huge. And, huge opportunities there for communications professionals.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen that in the last few years. There's been this kind of push and pull from organizations who really want to speak out on certain issues, right? Want to throw their hat in the ring, or on the opposite end of the spectrum have just decided this isn't for us. We're withdrawing from this conversation. We're not saying anything on this topic of the day, whatever it might be. I mean, can you tell me a little bit, what is the value in executives speaking out on social issues? And where do communicators really help guide that strategy?
That is a really good question. That is the sort of multi-million dollar question, because people do look to their executives to have a point of view. If you're working in a business or an organization, you look to your leader to give you a little bit of that inspiration, a little bit of that direction for your discretionary effort. And so our friends who work in employee engagement and internal communications, so much of what they do is about making sure that there is a line of sight from executives down to people in the business so that there's that alignment and the organization can kind of operate. That will probably make sense to people, even if they've got, no idea about politics. The issue about taking a view more broadly is in particularly more polarized times, it can be really difficult to know where to make that step. It's pretty easy to, for example, talk to a business about safety. Safety and, making sure we look after each other on the job. And if you're in a risky industry, safety might be fine. Might be a little bit more challenging to talk about women's rights, to talk about the right to choose, to talk about issues where there might be a little bit more doubt about where everybody stands on this and what the right thing to do is. So I understand the tension. I think the challenge for organisations is it's not as easy as it used to be to kind of opt out of issues, but that doesn't mean you need to dive in. You do need to think about what your organisation's purpose is, what you're actually there to do, and all of those communications basics. What am I here to do? Who am I here to speak to, and how? And to think about the environment you're in as part of that discussion, as part of that communications planning work. Because if you are a women's health organisation, then the right to choose probably is exactly what you should be talking about. If that's your whole job, to work in that field, then that could make sense. If you are producing bundles of agricultural products and you're completely, in a different field, then, you might want to talk about food security, or you might want to talk about agricultural policy. So thinking about what area you're in, thinking about what your stakeholders, both internal and external, expect, thinking about your business and your values will help guide you as to whether you should and how you should engage, on more political issues.
Yeah, I really like what you said too about there's been this increase in opting in, or this appearance of wanting to opt in, right? We've all got our different social media feeds. We're seeing the news on our phones in real time, right? It's, to your point, there's probably more noise than there has been in years past to an extent. So really coming back to basics and focusing on your values is where you can't go wrong.
I think that's true. And I think it actually adds heft. It adds respect to that conversation we've had for years about values and purpose and what's my why. A lot of this stuff has been said. And, to be fair, some people, even in our industry, have been very cynical about that. That's motherhood statements. That's just, corporate gobbledygook. But in actual fact, if your values mean anything, then they should guide whether you speak and how you should speak. And in terms of the communication professional's role, I don't think there's anybody in a business who's better placed than communications professionals to lead and guide on this kind of issue. Obviously, it's your executive, it's your chair, it's your president, it's your CEO that might be doing the speaking. But who are they going to turn to? Who has got the best line of sight to the voice of the customer, to, thinking about the external environment than we do? But, it requires us to be very choosy and very thoughtful, because some executives have a big ego and want to talk on everything. And in reality, if you talk about everything and it's not connected to your values or your purpose, and you're doing it for the ego rather than doing it for the business purpose, then you will run into problems. And that's where leaders can get in trouble. But if you're very thoughtful and you're very aligned, then it might be that you can work through that there is a very important and meaningful thing we can say in our community or our industry, and it can actually build and enhance the reputation of the organisation.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit and think about the fact that 2024 has been dubbed the year of elections, right? We've got 60 countries, excuse me, hosting national elections around the globe. I mean, that is certainly a banner year. From what you've observed, I mean, what have been some standout moments from a comms perspective, if we were to kind of break it down as practitioners and really look at that?
There's a lot of big themes, and it has been, a huge year, and obviously it's not over yet. There's still elections going on, and it's hard for all of us outside the US to not think about people inside the US, because it must be pretty all encompassing, especially if you're in some of those swing states. In terms of some of the big trends from 2024, I think this tension between the establishment and the popular is a really big trend that we've seen across Western democracies. So this idea of, more established traditional parties being challenged either by minor parties, so whether it's Reform in the UK, whether it's National Rally in France, whether it's the potential of third parties. I mean, RFK Jr., Jill Stein is still running, potential for third parties, that kind of movement away, and even to be fair, the change in the Republican Party to being much stronger Trumpian-led party rather than the way the Republican Party was traditionally established. Those big changes really do open up the political sphere for a lot more tension and a lot more unpredictability. And so for organizations, people listening to this podcast, working perhaps in more traditional structured organizations, the thought of that rise in populism, is quite a big trend, and I don't think it's going away. I think the greater gender voting gap is a big change. We're certainly starting to see traditional parties change, and the way in which they get their support is changing. So traditionally in the US, the Republican Party had people of higher education. Now they've got people of lower education more likely to vote for them. Traditionally, the Democrats had much more men, particularly, working class men voting for them. Now there's a lot more women voting for the Democrats. And we're seeing that in comparable democracies across the world. So I think this change, and rise of populism and also the gender voting gap, probably the big meta trends that we've seen across 2024. But to be fair, every election is different and every country is different. Probably the third that goes without saying is this increased drive of technology. And while social media is not new, and we've seen Twitter and TikTok in elections before, what we're really seeing now is the potential for even more disinformation and misinformation through AI and other forms. So they're probably the three big trends that I think we've seen in 2024 and that we will continue to see.
So on that note, election years can obviously lead to increased tension and polarization, or I guess to your point earlier, that's the trend we've seen in some ways more than in years past. And that can also lead to tension in the workplace. I know this has come up in discussion with our professional development and content committee, talking about in these years of high tension, polarization, how do you navigate that, especially in the workplace? How do you listen to others who have differing opinions from you? And where's that opportunity for communicators? What's the superpower that we can use to help shift the narrative?
It's so important. And I love this question because I think it reflects both the challenge and the hope in communications. And I think, I'd probably orientate it a few different ways. There is obviously polarization in the workplace, and that can be problematic. And as I alluded earlier, the idea of sort of competing political views in the workplace can be kind of scary for a communications professional to think about, how we're going to manage. But to take a step back, I think if diversity, equity, inclusion have taught us anything, it is that there's a lot of power in that diversity. There's a lot of rich insights and really opportunities for depth in communications to really understand where people are coming from. And I guess as professionals, if we see the power of DE&I and what it can do when people can bring their whole selves to work and people can be engaged, we've also got to realize the flip side of that, which is people are complex and some people are going to have different views. We see this in other domains. Politics is no different. I think how you deal with it is to really work hard on your internal culture in organizations and realize that culture comes from the top. And I think if you've got leadership, whether that's your primary leader or, divisional and lower level leaders or managers, can really be, tooled up, skilled up with information on how to have good conversations in the workplace. If there's a bit of time and space for communications to happen in the workplace, in some organizations, they spend a lot on bringing people together and having town halls and having offsites and planning days. If you've got some time and space, you can talk about what unites us. You can talk about why this is the difference for our business or company. If you spend some time there and actually allow people to, to understand, what brings them together, why we're here together, I think you can do something towards ensuring your organization isn't as polarized. But I don't think you can ignore the fact that society is getting more polarized. And if that's what's going on in society, you shouldn't expect your workplace to be so different. So I know I'm slightly being contradictory here, but there's actually two sides to this. And one is make space, make time, and try and allow for the conversation about what unites everybody in your organization, but also be realistic. There are households at the moment across the US where, one side of the house is going to vote one way and the other side of the house is going to vote the other way. Most people and families find a way through that. And I think that's the challenge for communications professionals. When things get hard, that's when we should put our best thinking in and really, lean in to that challenge. It's not easy to do this kind of communications, but we can do it.
I like that take. It's realistic, but helpful. So I want to end on a high note. We like to ask our guests this rather than what keeps you up at night. What gets you up in the morning, David?
Well, this definitely got me up in the morning. So I'm recording this not too early, but a little earlier than when I normally start my day in Melbourne. And I was very excited. I went to bed thinking about this podcast and what I might say. So I hope it's been useful. Genuinely, what gets me up in the morning is the chance to make a difference. I feel really privileged to work with organisations, some of which are explicitly for purpose, but some of them are regular corporates who, are doing their thing in the world, but will have a communications challenge that I've got the chance to help them with, whether it's a crisis, whether it's an issue. And I find that a great privilege. It's really exciting to be able to walk into an organisation and help them, guide them, listen to them, hold their hand, and produce something great together to get them, usually to the other side of their problem. I think that's a great gift. I think what we do across communications is a gift. And whilst it sometimes has its frustrations, it usually gets me up pretty happy.
Well, that's great. David, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for walking us through a primer of communications in a year of elections, and appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Pod Catalyst, the official podcast of IABC. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Have a suggestion for a future episode? Send us a note at catalyst@iabc.com. To discover all IABC has to offer, visit our website at iabc.com. Until next time.